Let's be clear, Russia is much diminished in terms of its international standing. Certainly, as far as the West is concerned, its reputation as a great military player has been significantly tarnished. In practical terms, it's lost lots of equipment, large numbers of troops, and for relatively limited gains. It has not achieved its maximalist gains in Ukraine by any means. Well, look, Mr. Lavrov has been the Russian foreign minister or represented Russian foreign policy in one way or another for up to 18 years or so, and he hasn't survived by avoiding towing the party line. So I'm afraid this latest interview with the BBC, my former colleague Steve Rosenberg, was just more of the same from the Russians, a restatement that they never invaded Ukraine, a restatement that Ukraine was run by a bunch of Nazis, an insistence that criticism from UN human rights groups and others at the United Nations was all due to Western pressure. And of course, an insistence also that Russia holds to international law, which having launched this unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is clearly nonsense. So I don't think there was much here that was new in the Russian position. But also it may reflect the fact that I think whatever Western analysts say, and there's a good deal of truth in what many of them say, the Russians clearly believe that for all their missteps in the early phases of this war, they do have some concrete gains on which they can present this as being something of a mitigated success.
Which does beg the question, does it not, that economic sanctions, flight bans, perhaps aren't having the intended effect?
I think they had an initial sort of shock value. I think the Russians clearly believed that the West was divided. I think they never imagined that the Western response would be as strong as it has been. Whether it actually needs to be stronger, of course, is another matter. But the sanctions are always something for the long term. They're not going to affect Mr. Putin's calculations in the short term. And of course, the other huge problem is that Russia has been continuing to earn vast sums of money from its energy exports. As the price of energy has gone up, the Russians have been banking the additional cash. And so there's no sign at the moment in terms of its central budget or its overall economy that Russia is going to be caught up short in any way and have to start rethinking its military adventure in Ukraine.
Let's just reflect, if we can, on the comments made by Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, as I mentioned, who has said that Russia has already strategically lost this war and is now a diminished power. What do you make of those comments?
Well, I think from a Western perspective, it's a reasonably fair assessment. Let's be clear, Russia is much diminished in terms of its international standing. Certainly, as far as the West is concerned, its reputation as a great military player has been significantly tarnished. In practical terms, it's lost lots of equipment, large numbers of troops, and for relatively limited gains. It has not achieved its maximalist gains in Ukraine by any means. The problem, I think, is that having said all that, Ukraine is hardly winning either. Huge swathes of its country are occupied by the Russians. Much of the rest of it is periodically under Russian fire. Ukraine's economy is devastated. It's not just the damage to its cities and its infrastructure, but obviously the Russians hold a huge swathe of Ukraine's coast. They are effectively blockading the country, so its grain exports and so on cannot get out of the very limited port facilities that remain to them. And of course, as the two sides, I think, approach a point where militarily they're both sort of heading towards a point of exhaustion, and I think in due course we may see a kind of a lull in the fighting. The fact remains that whilst Russia doesn't have huge amounts of reserves or new equipment it can draw on. We're seeing a lot of stuff coming out of old stocks to replace equipment the Russians have lost. Of course, neither does Ukraine. Ukraine is losing heavily. It's lost a lot of its best trained, most experienced troops. And it doesn't really, at the moment at least, have the wherewithal or the capacity to launch really significant counterattacks to take back territory it has already lost to the Russians. So, yes, from a Western perspective, Russia may be the great strategic loser in this, but Ukraine in the short and the medium term is clearly not winning. And I think also you have to say that viewed from a non-Western perspective, elsewhere in the world, China, South Africa, much of Africa, India, and so on, many of these countries do not see Russia's behavior in the same terms that the West does. So, yes, not a great success for the Russians by any means, but probably something that still they can present to their own people and to much of the rest of the world with their own narrative as being something that they can justify.
Yes, really important point. Just a final thought, a brief thought, if you would, on the news today that the European Union has given its blessing for Ukraine's membership to join the bloc. How significant a geopolitical shift is this?
Well, it's significant in symbolic terms. I mean, clearly remember it was the prospect of an association agreement with the European Union back in 2014 that prompted Russia's seizure of Crimea. It's the EU and the potential of Ukraine becoming a democratic, Western, successful country, a successful economy that really upsets the Russians, much more than NATO membership, I think, fundamentally. Of course, one shouldn't run away with the idea that this, for the moment, is anything but symbolic. I don't think Ukraine is going to be a member of the European Union anytime soon. There are many other candidate countries who've been waiting years and they're still not members. And of course, the vital thing now, beyond any of these symbolic gestures, is to step up arms deliveries, particularly artillery deliveries to Ukraine. Ukraine, essentially, in the coming month or year, needs to move to being a largely Western-equipped country, at least certainly in terms of its artillery arm, and it's going to have to go way beyond the welcome but relatively smaller infusions of support that they've had so far. Otherwise, the country has no chance of taking back the territory that it has lost.